It began not with thunder, but with a whisper. A single leak in Brussels revealed words heavy enough to topple economies: tariffs on Africa's oil and gold. Donald Trump, standing before NATO allies, called for higher walls around African exports. Bend them or let them starve. The arrogance was staggering, the threat unmistakable. But in Ouagadougou, the answer was not silence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked into the storm and named it for what it was: economic warfare cloaked in diplomacy. Where others trembled, he called for defiance. Where leaders elsewhere weighed comfort, he invoked dignity. From that moment, the conflict was no longer about tariffs. It became a test of sovereignty itself. And so the question now towers before us. Is this the beginning of Africa's long-awaited rebirth, or the West's greatest nightmare? Stay with us. This is more than headlines. It is the sound of history shifting under our feet. Subscribe, stand with the story, and do not look away. The leak was not meant to survive the night. It was a single page, slipped out of a closed-door meeting in Brussels, carrying the weight of an empire's intention. Donald Trump's voice had thundered behind those walls, demanding that NATO allies erect tariffs on Africa's lifeblood, oil and gold. His words were blunt, almost cruel. Raise the barriers, starve them into submission, let them crawl back to dependency. In European corridors, silence followed. Some leaders lowered their eyes, unwilling to confront Washington's shadow. Others wrestled quietly with conscience, recognizing that what was being demanded was nothing less than economic warfare disguised in the robes of diplomacy. It was not a policy. It was a weapon. One man, unknown to most, let his conscience dictate his action. The page slipped away. The whisper escaped, and that whisper reached Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not read it as speculation. He read it as a declaration. The document spoke not only of tariffs, but of control, of a return to the old pattern where Africa's wealth was extracted while its people were told to wait for aid. Traoré had seen enough of such cycles. This was not simply trade. It was an ultimatum against dignity itself. By dawn, his advisors were assembled. The room was tense but not afraid. This is not about taxes. Traoré's voice rang clear. This is about chains. If we bow today, tomorrow we will kneel forever. His words cut through hesitation like a blade. Within hours, calls rippled across the Sahel. From Bamako to Niamey, from Conakry to Ouagadougou, leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States were summoned. The gathering was unlike the polished conferences of Geneva or Paris. No crystal chandeliers, no gilded halls. Instead, a guarded room thick with the weight of history. Around the table sat men and women who carried the scars of foreign contracts, leaders whose treasuries had been drained while their villages remained in dust. Each voice spoke of the same pattern: oil siphoned away, gold stolen through loopholes, revenues vanishing into foreign banks. Aid had been the bandage, dependency the infection. But in that room, for the first time in decades, the language changed. It was no longer about pleading for leniency or negotiating crumbs. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder. Traoré's words hung in the air like a verdict. If they dare to impose tariffs, then we will dare to close the flow. Let their markets feel the hunger they wished for us. The decision was not made lightly. Shutting the taps of oil and gold meant tightening belts at home. It meant bracing for shortages, for hardship, for the slow grind of sanctions. Yet one by one, heads nodded. Mali, Guinea, Niger, and beyond, fractured voices began to converge. The choice was not between comfort and suffering, but between slavery and sovereignty. When news of the secret summit leaked, it did not come through official communiques. It came through the voices of ordinary people. A radio station in Bamako carried fragments of speeches. Social media in Niamey filled with defiant chants. In Ouagadougou's streets, students painted slogans on walls. If they want our oil and gold, they must first break our dignity. Markets across Africa buzzed with rumor. Merchants whispered of higher prices. Farmers worried about buyers. Mothers fretted over medicine and school fees. Yet beneath the anxiety, something else stirred. Pride. For years, Africans had watched their resources drain away while being told to be grateful for loans and lectures. Now, for the first time, their leaders had dared to say no. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In Independence Square, a young student raised a placard. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. The crowd roared, not with fear, but with recognition. Hardship was not new. What was new was leadership that refused to barter dignity for bread. In Brussels, ministers scrambled. What they had dismissed as whispers was now a storm. Traders in Frankfurt watched gold prices surge. Energy planners in Paris trembled at the thought of grids without Niger's uranium. Executives in Milan stared at cobalt contracts slipping away. Suddenly, the dependency was reversed. Europe needed Africa far more than Africa needed Europe, and everyone knew it. The world's gaze had shifted. A continent long treated as a resource pit was now standing tall, hand on the valve, daring the West to blink first. The decision of that room in Ouagadougou had cracked open a new reality, and the question lingered like thunder on the horizon. How far would Africa's defiance go? Would the world retaliate with compromise or with fury? The decision from Ouagadougou did not remain hidden in sealed documents. It spilled onto the streets, into marketplaces, into the rhythm of daily life. For decades, ordinary people had felt invisible in the drama of power, but now they were participants. Their voices rose alongside their leaders. In Bamako's narrow alleys, children painted oil barrels in the colors of African flags. In Niamey, radio broadcasts replayed fragments of the Sahel summit. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, crowds gathered beneath the sun, listening to whispers of defiance carried on cheap transistor radios. The air trembled with a sense of history unfolding in real time. Fear was present. Merchants fretted over empty shelves. Farmers wondered whether their harvests would rot unsold. Mothers tightened their grip on their children as they spoke of rising food prices. But alongside the anxiety burned something older and deeper: pride. For the first time in living memory, the script had changed. Africa was not reacting to Europe. Africa was dictating terms. Then came the image that would circle the continent. On national television, Ibrahim Traoré appeared not in front of velvet curtains or ornate podiums, but at a plain wooden stand. Around him stood no generals in pressed uniforms, but miners still dusted with gold powder, farmers with calloused hands, and engineers in worn jackets. This was not theater. It was symbolism. It was sovereignty rendered visible. "They call us reckless," Traoré said, his voice steady, his tone unpolished but unflinching. "I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. From this day forward, they will not flow without dignity." The words traveled faster than any decree. Radios carried them into villages where elders nodded in recognition. Smartphones lit up in Lagos and Kinshasa as youth reposted the speech with a single phrase: "If Traoré stands, we stand." It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about a continental identity rediscovered. Markets in Europe convulsed. In Frankfurt, gold prices spiked like a rocket, traders' screens flashing red. In Paris, energy planners admitted nervously that more than half of France's nuclear grid depended on uranium from Niger, a supply now in doubt. In Milan, executives from the electric car industry gathered in panic, realizing that without cobalt and lithium from Congo, their green revolution could stall before it began. Africa's oil and gold were not luxuries. They were oxygen. And Ibrahim Traoré had placed his hand on the valve. In Washington, Donald Trump thundered. At rallies, he promised to teach Africa its place, his rhetoric wrapped in the language of dominance. The crowds cheered, but in diplomatic corridors, unease rippled. The more Trump roared, the more the world saw not Africa on its knees, but a global order showing cracks. Meanwhile, BRICS nations moved with precision. Beijing announced emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks. Moscow offered joint ventures in gold refining and oil drilling, rebranding resources so that tariffs could not touch them. New Delhi pledged to purchase Sahelian crude under long-term agreements, guaranteeing a market regardless of Europe's threats. Each move carried a simple message. Africa would not stand alone. This international backing emboldened the Sahel alliance. For the first time in decades, leaders felt they were not simply begging for survival, but bargaining from a place of strength. The tide of dependency was shifting, yet the cost at home was real. Medicines grew scarce. Families rationed food. Electricity grids flickered under strain. Opposition media predicted collapse. Western outlets painted Traoré as a reckless populist, dragging his people into ruin. But something else was happening beneath the hardship. Communities that once fractured along ethnic and political lines began to close ranks. Volunteers distributed food in rural villages. Students set up solidarity networks to keep schools open. Farmers pooled resources to ensure harvests reached local markets. What was meant to fracture Africa was, paradoxically, welding it together. Internationally, the optics shifted dramatically. In South America, activists drew parallels with their own battles against resource exploitation. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity. Across the diaspora in Paris and New York, rallies erupted in support, demanding transparency from Western corporations and solidarity with Africa's stand. In Berlin, opposition lawmakers asked whether ordinary European workers should bear the cost of a tariff war. In Paris, unions warned of layoffs if gold flows collapsed. In London, late-night commentators asked the unthinkable. Have we underestimated Africa's power? The escalation was unstoppable. What had begun as a whisper in Brussels was now a roar across continents. And in the center of it all stood a young captain from Burkina Faso, turning economic blackmail into a battle for sovereignty. Could Africa's unity endure when sanctions tightened and the full weight of retaliation descended? The defiance of Ouagadougou reverberated across Africa, but so too did its price. On the ground, the effects of the standoff cut deep. In marketplaces from Bamako to Niamey, prices of imported goods rose overnight. Shelves once stocked with medicines and fuel began to thin. Mothers worried about their children's school fees, while farmers wondered if their crops would find buyers beyond their borders. For decades, hardship had been familiar, yet this time, it felt different. Hardship was not the result of mismanagement or neglect. It was a conscious choice to endure for sovereignty rather than bow for survival. The narrative shifted from resignation to resistance. Better hunger with dignity than comfort in chains became a phrase on everyone's lips. Communities adapted quickly. Volunteers in rural villages organized food distribution. Student unions created networks to keep schools running with limited resources. Farmers shared tools and seeds, ensuring that fields were not abandoned. Local cooperatives formed around grain, maize, and cotton, seeking to build internal markets less dependent on European buyers. The state responded with urgency. Security forces were deployed to mining zones, not only to defend against sabotage, but to symbolize control over resources long plundered. Economists advised on stabilizing local currencies with reserves of gold. Engineers in Niger and Burkina Faso labored overnight to keep electricity grids from collapse. In Mali, Parliament voted to create a national reserve fund stocked with oil and gold revenues. A buffer against sanctions, Western retaliation escalated. European banks froze accounts linked to state-owned companies. Insurance firms refused to cover African shipments. Cargo ships, laden with oil and bullion, sat stranded in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork under review. Cyber attacks disrupted financial transfers and crashed government websites. On television, coordinated campaigns painted Traore as reckless, warning Africans that their suffering would break them. And yet, the effect was not division, but cohesion. People understood what was happening. They saw the sanctions, the smear campaigns, the cyber strikes, and recognized them as proof of the struggle's legitimacy. Each blockade, each disruption hardened public resolve. The image of Traore standing before miners, farmers, and engineers continued to echo. He was not portrayed as a distant general, but as a son of the soil, a man among his people. This visual disarmed propaganda that sought to brand him a dictator. Instead, he became a symbol of endurance, one whose words resonated in dusty villages and crowded capitals alike. Politically, the standoff reshaped alliances. Within the alliance of Sahel states, discussions turned from crisis management to long-term sovereignty. Leaders began drafting an African Resource Charter, an agreement that oil, gold, and uranium would be treated not merely as commodities, but as instruments of independence. No longer would contracts be signed in secret. No longer would revenues vanish into offshore accounts. The dream of sovereignty was being given institutional form. This internal reconfiguration carried risks. Opposition voices in Burkina Faso warned of economic collapse. Critics in Guinea argued that the price of confrontation could undo decades of fragile progress. But each time dissent threatened to fracture unity, revelations of Western dependency and leaked documents about hidden contracts renewed solidarity. What was once doubt now became defiance. International observers took note. Analysts in Europe quietly admitted that sanctions were hurting European industries more than African resilience. In Berlin, the phrase, "sanction them and we sanction ourselves," gained traction. In Paris, labor unions warned of layoffs. In London, newspapers began to ask if Africa had finally flipped the script of dependency. At the heart of it all, Ibrahim Traoré was painted in Western media as reckless. But within Africa, he was seen as transformative. His coup, once criticized, was reinterpreted as the turning point where Burkina Faso refused to bow. It was not only a matter of politics, but of psychology. A collective assertion that Africa would no longer be dictated to. This was the essence of the struggle. Not just tariffs, not just contracts, but the right to define destiny. The crisis had sparked a political awakening that could not easily be undone. And as the belts tightened, the sense of dignity only grew stronger. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was no longer remembered only as a seizure of power in Burkina Faso. It was rebranded, in the eyes of millions, as the genesis of Africa's stand for sovereignty. Could this newfound resilience withstand the weight of drones in the sky, cyber strikes on the ground, and the tightening noose of global sanctions? From Brussels to Washington, the defiance of the Sahel cracked open long-held assumptions about global power. What had begun as a tariff proposal now morphed into a diplomatic earthquake, testing not only Africa, but the unity of the West itself. In Washington, Donald Trump's tone was unyielding. At rallies, he promised to break Africa's will, casting the standoff as a test of Western dominance. They will crawl back once their treasuries run dry, one advisor declared behind closed doors. The message was clear. Africa was to be punished until it submitted. Yet beyond the roar of speeches, doubts began to whisper through American corridors. Could sanctions truly work against nations willing to endure suffering for dignity? Europe's position was even more fragile. In Berlin, a minister quietly warned, "Sanction them, and we sanction ourselves." German auto manufacturers depended on cobalt from Congo. France's nuclear grid leaned heavily on Niger's uranium. In Milan, the electric car industry panicked over the loss of lithium supplies. Each dependency laid bare a reality long avoided. Europe needed Africa's resources far more than Africa needed European markets. Political divisions deepened. In Paris, labor unions threatened strikes if gold flows stalled. In London, commentators asked whether Europe had underestimated Africa's leverage. Across European capitals, opposition parties seized the moment, portraying governments as puppets of Washington, sacrificing their own workers to wage economic war against the continent. While the West scrambled, BRICS nations seized opportunity. Beijing rolled out emergency credit lines, allowing African exporters to bypass Western banks. Moscow proposed joint ventures in oil refining and gold mining, rebranding commodities under Eurasian contracts immune to Western tariffs. New Delhi pledged to purchase Sahelian crude on long-term terms, ensuring African oil would not be stranded. Each step was calculated, deliberate, and symbolic. Africa was not alone. It was courted. Beyond the mechanics of trade, something larger was unfolding. In South America, activists saw echoes of their own battles against foreign exploitation. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity, aligning their struggles with Africa's. Even in Western cities, diaspora communities rallied, demanding transparency from corporations and solidarity with Africa's leaders. The international stage had shifted. For decades, Africa was cast as a junior partner, dependent on aid, waiting for approval. Now it stood at the center of global debate, no longer asking, but dictating. The rhetoric of partnership from European leaders suddenly rang hollow, exposed by leaked documents showing secret contracts designed to control Africa's oil and gold for half a century. Observers began to label the defiance not merely as a political crisis, but as the Burkina Faso revolution, a catalyst that was rewriting the grammar of global power. If Africa could bend the very structures of international order, what new chapter of world history was about to be written? The standoff had already redrawn the map of power, but the question remained, what comes next? For the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states, survival was not enough. They wanted permanence. They wanted a framework that could shield Africa from ever returning to the old cycle of dependency. Thus began the drafting of the African Resource Charter. Unlike past agreements written in Paris or London, this one was born in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey. Its purpose was simple but profound. Africa's oil, gold, uranium, and cobalt would never again be treated as mere commodities. They would be instruments of sovereignty, safeguarded not just by governments, but by the will of the people. The vision was daring. Revenues from oil and gold would not vanish into offshore accounts, but be directed into sovereign funds. Infrastructure would be built not with foreign contractors extracting rents, but with African engineers laying the bricks of their own future. Local markets would be strengthened, ensuring farmers, miners, and workers could thrive without waiting on approvals from European capitals. The risks were undeniable. Sanctions could tighten further. Cyber attacks might escalate. Surveillance drones might give way to more aggressive tactics. Western media would continue to smear leaders as reckless populists. The specter of isolation loomed large. Yet the leaders of the Sahel alliance believed the greater danger lay in surrender. For ordinary Africans, the path ahead was steep. Prices were high, shortages persistent, and the weight of sanctions heavy. But the hardship felt different this time. It was not the despair of being controlled, but the burden of forging independence. Suffering with dignity is not defeat. One elder in Niamey told a journalist, "It is the seed of freedom." Internationally, the trajectory was equally uncertain. BRICS support provided lifelines, but new partnerships carried their own risks of dependency. To navigate this, African leaders moved cautiously, determined to avoid trading one master for another. The Resource Charter was designed precisely for this, to ensure that foreign partnerships, whether from East or West, would operate on Africa's terms. The symbolism mattered as much as the policies. Across the continent, murals bloomed on city walls, depicting oil barrels wrapped in African flags, miners raising fists, and farmers planting seeds beneath slogans of dignity. Diaspora communities in Europe and America echoed the imagery, turning a regional struggle into a global movement. For the first time in generations, the continent was not waiting for outside definitions of its future. It was drafting its own script, however uncertain, however fragile. Could this fragile unity hold long enough to transform defiance into a permanent foundation of sovereignty? Or would the weight of global retaliation force Africa back into chains? It began as a whisper in Brussels, a single leak, a page almost forgotten. But that whisper ignited a storm that shook capitals across the globe. What was meant to be tariffs became something far greater, a struggle over dignity, sovereignty, and the right of a continent to decide its own future. From the first defiant words in Ouagadougou to the chants in crowded squares, Africa turned sanctions into solidarity. Each cyber attack, each embargo, each propaganda smear was meant to fracture the Sahel. Instead, it welded nations closer together. The very tools of pressure became proof that this was not about trade. It was about freedom. Europe discovered a truth it had long concealed, that its nuclear grids, its car factories, its banking systems leaned on Africa more than Africa leaned on Europe. Washington, in its arrogance, underestimated the cost of pushing too far, and the BRICS nations seized the opening, offering lifelines that reframed Africa not as a recipient of aid, but as a partner in trade. At the center stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as a young officer with little chance of altering history. His stand became a symbol. His coup, derided by critics, was reimagined as the spark that lit a wider fire. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was no longer just a domestic upheaval. It was remembered as the turning point of a continent's awakening. And in the echoes of his speeches, it was clear. This was more than politics. It was identity. For Burkina Faso and for Africa as a whole, the struggle became known by another name: the Burkina Faso Revolution. A revolution not fought with tanks or missiles, but with voices, with unity, with the courage to close the taps on oil and gold until respect replaced exploitation. Ibrahim Traoré coup. Ibrahim Traoré coup. Burkina Faso Revolution. These are no longer just words. They are the signposts of a chapter still being written, a declaration that sovereignty is not granted. It is seized, protected, and lived. And so the story closes, not with certainty, but with a question that belongs to us all. If one small, landlocked nation can stand tall, what stops the rest of the world from doing the same? If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, share this story, and walk with us into the future Africa has chosen for itself.